For the past couple of months, I've been really enjoying my 16-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro for everything like snappy web browsing on a daily basis, the incredible battery life that can last days without needing a charge, the beautiful new mini LED display for watching shows and movies, and of course, high performance for doing things like photo editing in Photoshop and video editing in Final Cut Pro. But Intel, AMD, and Nvidia have been showing off new processors and graphics chips at this year's CES, which will be going into new laptops as soon as the end of this year. And from the looks of it, Apple's MacBook Pro is going to be seriously challenged on every single front. And even though the M1 Max is truly impressive for things like video and photo editing, programming, music production, and more, there are still some areas where the M1 Max just isn't that great because of a lack of proper software support. Take gaming, for example, where the only optimized game right out of the box is World of Warcraft, which performs exceptionally well when compared to a desktop RTX 3080 GPU. But other than that, the FPS numbers that we got in games that rely on Rosetta 2 translation and apps like Crossover 2.1 just weren't that impressive. And those are the games that are actually supported, since the latest DirectX 12 API currently has zero support with Crossover. And then if we take a look at other things like raw multi-threaded CPU performance and apps like Cinebench R23, AMD's best 5900HX chip from last year is already right there next to the 14-inch M1 Max. And then going further, looking at graphics rendering performance, the new Blender 3.1 Alpha build greatly improved performance for many of the tests that we ran, but the RTX 3080 within the Razer Blade was still faster overall, and it's even worse for other rendering apps that don't have decent support. And to make things worse, Intel, AMD, and Nvidia have just unveiled some incredibly impressive mobile chips that are gonna fly past even the best version of the M1 Max chip. So without further ado, let's jump right into some CES keynotes, starting with Intel's.
Our 12th Gen H series delivers up to 40% higher performance than our prior generation.
And there you go, they just unveiled the new 12th generation mobile chips, and these things look promising. Look at that, up to 5 gigahertz clock speeds, up to 14 cores combining performance and efficiency cores, just like the M1 Max is doing. These things are gonna be very powerful, especially since they're saying up to 40% higher performance gen over gen. And within their keynote, Intel actually claimed that their new i9 processor is gonna be faster than Apple's M1 Max chip. So check out this chart right here. You could see this is basically a copy of what Apple showed off at their last event, showing the M1 Max having better performance per the power that it uses, better than the 5900HX, as you can see in that red line, and better than the last i9 11980HK. And you can see their new i9 12900 is above and beyond what the M1 Max can do, which is incredibly impressive. And based on this, I fully believe when we actually get them in our hands that those chips are gonna have more raw performance than the M1 Max, which is really disappointing because with the M1 Max chip, it only got better graphics performance instead of better CPUs. Now, however, the caveat is that Intel says that they'll use up to 115 watts of maximum power, which is a ton, literally a ton of power. As you can see in this chart right here, you could see that a lot of these chips are using up to 115, the i7s and the i9s. The i5s actually go up to 95 watts. Now keep in mind that when we tested the M1 Max chip, the maximum amount of power that it gave to the CPU was 30 watts. Yes, that's 30 instead of 115, so it kind of makes sense why these Alder Lake chips would be faster. And if you're wondering just how much faster the new Alder Lakes are gonna be, we already compared the M1 Max 16-inch to the Razer Blade, which had the i9 11900H, and in Geekbench 5's multi-core CPU test, it scored up to 9,300 points, so the M1 Max still had a good lead. But if you look over to how much the top of the line line 11980HK scored, that scored up to 10,000 points. So if you apply Intel's 40% improvement, we should be getting around 14,000, which will technically beat the M1 Max, and I'm sure it'll do even better in Cinebench R23. So with that said, I think there's a pretty good chance that even some of Intel's i7 chips will be able to outperform the M1 Max in terms of raw CPU performance. Now that doesn't mean real world performance and real tasks, because we are going to be testing that out as soon as we get those new laptops, so definitely subscribe right now so you don't miss out on those in-depth comparisons, but I guess we'll see. And finally, Intel did show off a new technology, which is very surprising. Apparently, they're going to be able to integrate your iPhone and your Apple Watch with their new laptops and PCs, so you're essentially going to be able to read your iMessages through an Intel-based PC, which is very impressive. And one of the things that really disappoints me about the new MacBook Pro is that it does not support Wi-Fi 6E, which every single Intel Alder Lake chip is gonna support. So that's very disappointing, because I could have bought a new Wi-Fi 6E router, but I chose Wi-Fi 6 instead because I just don't have that on my MacBook Pro. And the last thing Intel showed off was their new Deep Link technology, which basically uses the integrated GPU within the Alder Lake chip and the discrete Intel Arc graphics chip together to improve encoding speed by up to 1.4 times, which is actually very impressive. So I guess we'll see how that compares to the M1 Max chip when we get our hands on those. And now let's move on to AMD, because they also introduced some very impressive laptop chips. So let's listen.
Hey, I'm proud to launch our AMD Ryzen 6000 series mobile processors.
6000 series.
That deliver leadership performance, battery life, and much, much more.
All right, check this out. It's their Zen 3 Plus, so it's basically updated, but the cool thing is that it's on the new 6nm technology, the new process node, so it's gonna be gaining in terms of efficiency as well as performance.
With boost speeds up to 5 gigahertz, we're delivering an average of 1.3x faster performance compared to the 5000 series.
Now, if you didn't know how fast the AMD chips were, check this out. In terms of Geekbench 5, the M1 Max MacBook Pro was basically killing the last top-of-the-line 5900HX mobile chip that AMD had. So that's 12,600 compared to 9,000. However, if you bring it into Cinebench R23, you can see right there that the 5900HX is literally right behind the M1 Max in 100% CPU workloads. Now imagine adding 1.3 times to that number with the 6000 series. Yes, it looks like it's gonna destroy the M1 Max chip, and they might even have some lower end models that are gonna be at the same level or even outperform it. So it's a little bit disappointing that we don't have that much CPU performance with the M1 Max. And this right here is the real kicker. AMD says that they're getting up to 24 hours of battery life on a laptop. Now that's probably using a laptop with a 99 watt-hour battery, just like the 16-inch MacBook Pro, but it's because of the new 6nm process technology. They have the new power management, they have the new adaptive power control. So basically, with all that said, they say they're getting up to that much. Now, I'd have to see it to believe it, because we tested the previous Razer Blade and it had horrible battery life, so I guess we'll have to test it out and see. And now getting to the next section, they have their new AMD APUs, which is basically a CPU with an integrated GPU, but here they're showing off their new AMD RDNA 2 graphics architecture, and here you can see some pretty massive gains in terms of FPS compared to the previous chips, like the 1165 G7, which goes into smaller 13-inch laptops. Look at that, 303% more FPS in Doom Eternal, and a more popular title, which is CSGO, 146%. So this basically shows that they're gonna have actual competitive laptops without dedicated graphics that you could actually play games with. And the best part is that you have decent gaming support with Windows 11 instead of the crappy situation with macOS where you don't have that many games that are supported. And right here they're showing off some new specs, like for example, they got Gen 4 PCI Express, USB 4, but as you can see they have Wi-Fi 6E just like Intel, and Bluetooth Low Energy 5.2 compared to this MacBook Pro, which just has 5.0, which is also something that's disappointing. Of course, you have DDR5 on those new chips, and they also have HDMI 2.1, which the MacBook Pro does not have, unfortunately, and apparently they also have an AV1 media engine, which is also nice for the Windows side. And finally, this slide is showing off that they're gonna have these new chips into notebooks or laptops starting February. So next month, we're gonna be getting in these new laptops and comparing them to this 16-inch MacBook Pro. And now with that said, let's finally finish off with Nvidia's keynote. And here they're showing off a new RTX 3080 Ti mobile chip for laptops. And this looks absolutely insane. Basically the fastest graphics in laptops ever, and I fully believe it's gonna outperform the M1 Max like crazy, especially since they're showing off up to 16 gigs of the fastest GDDR6 VRAM, which is gonna be very impressive. And what's blowing my mind is that those laptops are gonna start at $2,500, which is exactly what this 16-inch MacBook Pro starts at, but that's without the M1 Max chip. You actually have to pay more, especially if you want the fully loaded, you're paying $3,500. And then going further, they showed off the 3070 Ti starting at only $1,500. And there's a chance that that chip is also gonna outperform the M1 Max in terms of graphics rendering and gaming and other tasks like that, which is just crazy. Like, these guys are coming back with so much performance at such a great value. It's just so impressive. And one thing that blew my mind was this chart in terms of graphics rendering apps, and here they are showing off some massive performance gains compared to a M1 Max MacBook Pro 16-inch. Like, for example, Blender cycles, they're showing 10 compared to 153 in terms of minutes. Now, obviously that does not make sense, and that's with the Blender cycles that does not support the GPU, that's actually CPU based. And as we know, the new alpha build 3.1 of Blender finally supports it, and it definitely sped it up for us. So you shouldn't rely on this chart because it's not showing the new alpha version. But I think what's the most accurate is to look at Redshift, because Redshift is what Apple used in their charts when they showed off the M1 Max chip. So here you can see 10 minutes instead of 28, that's almost 3 times faster, and I fully believe that this is realistic, and these chips are gonna be that much faster than the MacBook Pro for graphics rendering like that. With that said, I'm very impressed with Intel's, Nvidia's, and AMD's CES keynotes because they're showing off some very impressive gains that I was not expecting at all. So this is very impressive, and I'm excited to get those in my hands. So if you have any thoughts on those keynotes or those new chips, definitely comment them down below. And if you're not already subscribed, do so right now because you don't want to miss out on those laptop comparisons compared to the M1 Max. So thank you guys for watching. Check out one of those 2 videos right there, and we'll see you in the next video.